Good morning. Please turn with me to Joel, the very first chapter, as we look at the concept of the title today, gaps, gaps, gaps. And because we are in football season, going towards kind of the end of the season, end of the college season for sure, because they are in the playoffs. And likewise, the pros are headed toward their playoff season, Super Bowl, all that. It reminded me, though, of the ad campaign, I think it is from Allstate. They got a character called Mayhem. And Mayhem is one of those characters. If you ever watch his commercials, one, I think they're pretty funny. But he talks about, before there was in the news, the New York CEO shooter who was basically celebrated for a lot of people because he shot a man that many would blame for representing the way that there are times when insurance companies can take in plenty of premiums, but they aren't always there when you need them. And so even though it is never okay to celebrate the death, there was a surprising groundswell of support, not for the victim of the shooting, but the shooter. Reminded me that this time of year, that shooter isn't the only one who has tapped into that concept of gaps in coverage, because that entire Allstate ad campaign was based on don't get caught short with cut rate coverage. Meaning there are insurers that will take in your money. Even the industry knows that. But when you need them, there are gaps in coverage. And we have a very famous football season ad campaign that goes to that very concept. And the reason why that struck me as being so important in the book of Joel is I read it, once again, one of those books I'm not very familiar with. And so I'm going through it, and last week they asked me in the young adults class, Marcus, what's Joel about? Or something like that. I was like, I don't know. So I spent a whole lot of time trying to give them history because that's what I thought I kind of understood. And I did understand last week that there are these 100-year cycles that the prophets seem to come through in. And so basically you had the kingdom. Before it was divided, it was David who said a lot of wise things in the Psalms. Some of them we'll look at today. Roughly 100 years later, we will have Joel. And so we're going back in time, honestly, to the point in time after, really before where we were at the end of the major prophets, Ezekiel and Daniel, when they're already in captivity. If I haven't already said it, we're going back in the time loop. But we're going back even further before the time of Isaiah. To about 100 years before Isaiah, we've got Joel. I think he's primarily prophesying to the northern kingdom because it only began to make sense to me when I started looking at some of the historical things that happened during the kings of Israel that seem at least somewhat consistent with what Joel is saying here. And so as I began to realize that, wait a minute, there was this great drought that was so bad that one of Joel's contemporaries, somebody we might remember by the name of Elijah, his successor, had a king who wanted to kill him because the drought got so bad in the land. They were just looking for somebody to basically blame it on. And the prophets were one of those. Joel was his contemporary. But 100 years later, about 100 years later, when Isaiah came through, and then about 100 years later when we see Jeremiah and Daniel, it's the same thing. And that's what got me stuck. It's because I was like, wait a minute, this sounds like the same old story all over again, right? They sinned in about this 7 or 8 different ways, and God was going to bring in an army because they were sinning, but he was going to give them a last chance that, of course, they weren't going to take. So they're going to get invaded anyway. I was like, what's different? And it was only about the 10th time I went through the story, I realized, I think this whole story, all 3 chapters, is nothing more than a story about some bugs. Crickets much. And I was like, well, what? Okay, you got to look at it on your own time, but let's go through a few passages. It might make it seem like Marcus isn't completely nutty and thinking this is just a story about some bugs and how they exposed the gaps in Israel's coverage. As we begin in Joel chapter 1, right about verse 4. I'm going to read them all, but I started with verse 4 in the heading. The word of the Lord that came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, the elders. Give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. Verse 4, what the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. That's the part we've already looked at. However, if you skip forward to chapter 2, round about verse 6, this is where it began to become clear to me that I think he is basically talking about a bunch of bugs, because he's going to talk about, after he's talking about the bugs, he's going to talk about an army. And last week, I kind of tried to keep it simple by simply saying, okay, there's going to be some bugs and there's going to be an army. I think the bugs are the army. Why do you think that? Verse 6. Before them, peoples are in anguish. All faces grow pale. Like warriors, they charge. Like soldiers, they scale the wall. They march each on his way. They do not swerve from their paths. They do not jostle one another. Each marches in his path. They burst through the weapons and are not halted. They leap on the city. They run upon the walls. They climb up into the houses, and they enter through the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and the moon are darkened. The stars withdraw their shining. The Lord utters his voice before his army. Okay, that's one hint. But let's skip down to verse 25 and see why Marcus thinks that this whole army is just a bunch of bugs. Verse 25. I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, the cutter, my great army, which I sent among you. And that is why I think all this is just talking about some bugs. But why does that matter, Marcus? Why is it a big deal? Well, the first thing that may catch your attention the way that it caught mine is if it took me, as I say from time to time, as much as I read the Bible, if it took me about 10 times going through this story to realize that he's talking to them about the way he's about to do the same old thing a very different way, then it might help us to understand that God and our expectations are often in two completely different places. And there are three things I want to talk about today that really caught my attention in helping us understand a new perspective on what seems to be the same old pattern, and then the lesson will be yours. The first thing, if you go back with me to chapter 2, is verse 8, where it says, they burst through the weapons. They burst through the weapons. One of the things we talked about from time to time is the way in which in the Psalms, we said God has a way of ensuring us beyond our ability to comprehend and protect. And the thing that makes God different in the sense that he is able to take care of all those things that I can't take care of when I'm worried about going to work, trying to look after family, trying to do this and trying to do that, is basically he says, if you will simply do the simple things I ask you to do, all those gaps in your coverage I take care of. The things that you would otherwise worry about that you can't possibly understand. There's a story I've told before. Once I was moving overseas, I was working two jobs. One was in New Mexico, the other one was in Texas. But it wasn't just New Mexico, Texas, like we hop across the border to Washington State, right? To Clarkston. No, I was working in, like he said, wanting to be away from the South. I was working on the border of Louisiana and in the border of Texas and the borders New Mexico, driving roughly 5 hours every 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, as I mentioned to you, there were some gaps in the spaces of my home that I learned about because mice started to get in. As my realtor told me, once you're not living there, Marcus, there's some other things that might actually decide that they want to move in. And so ultimately what happened was when I looked at the gospel, when I looked at Joel's story this week, talking about the gaps in Israel's defenses, it reminded me of the way that we talked about how God reminds me of something the old boss told me. He said, Marcus, as much as you can, do your best to protect your word, your credibility. This is a secular man, and he was repeating something a boss had told me before, but he told me in a different way. Once again, I'm still reviewing. These are old illustrations. But he said, do your best to undersell and over-deliver. What we're looking at this week is the flip side of that. We've already talked about that in the terms of the way that God over-delivers in protecting our lives in areas that we can't necessarily cover. But this week, one of the things I hope to make clear through this book is the way in which the enemy has taken Israel from a point in time where David knew clearly, my strength is not in the bow. My sword cannot save me. To 100 years later, God is having to repeat the same message through the prophet Joel because ultimately they have bought into the way in which the enemy oversells and underdelivers. And that is the message of Allstate and Mayhem. Understanding that there are times in life where sounds like flat out when I'm trying to um, avoid reviewing too much. But we talked about it before, just in the way of a little bit more review. There are times in life when God brings us problems that the weapons that we have been given, they can't handle. We talked about how we're blessed to have a security team. We're blessed to have Eric leading that security team, making sure that as we learn different gaps in our system, that he's taking care of that, taking the lead to make sure that those things are shored up to the best of our ability. But we've also talked about the way in which the reason why it's important to have a godly man leading your security team is he understands the limits of what security can do. Basically, we've said it before, in short terms, there are problems that life can give us that we simply can't shoot. And so one of the reasons why it's important to have a godly man leading your security team, you could hire anybody, but you want somebody who understands the limits of the weapons, the limits of the security systems, exactly what's going on here in the book of Joel. Because what's happening is, if this is a book that's about nothing more than a bunch of bugs, it reminded me of another story, a movie, back when Sigourney Weaver was doing the Alien series of movies. And it reminded me of, just like you'll hear about I guess it's called the death funnel that I've heard soldiers describe. When they are facing numbers that are basically a disadvantage, one of the ways they can swing things back into their favor is to force an enemy through a small space that they just can't squeeze all of their numerical advantages through. And so when I was watching the movie Aliens, they thought they had funneled the aliens through what they would call, I guess, a death funnel. But as they had their, back then what seemed like it was high tech, what we just call it now GPS, tracking the enemy that was coming through the front door that they were perfectly capable of defending. What they started realizing was, wait a minute, it's saying they're in the room with us, but I don't see a thing, or I don't see anything. And as they began to realize what was going on, they were in unfamiliar territory. They shone their lights up and realized that they were crawling through the ducts of the building. And so they were surrounded before they knew what could happen. And the rest of the story is, don't go watch the movie. But the rest of the story is history. Ultimately, their plans were limited by the realization that there was something larger going on that was far beyond what they had planned to take care of. Understanding that, let me just move forward to chapter 2. So one of the things we studied before is the way in which God can bring us situations or problems that weapons can't take care of. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to have godly people in positions of authority, as we have elders, and deacons even. One of the structures that God put in place for picking deacons was, even though originally the role of deacon in the book of Acts was simply to make sure that tables were cleaned and food was evenly distributed amongst the widows, one of the requirements was that the elders and the deacons especially had to be men of integrity. And that's one of the reasons why, as much as we could hire anyone that we could to defend the building, it's important to basically look to praying men who understand that God is the one who essentially secures us. But beyond that, the second thing that caught my attention is in chapter 2, beginning about verse 28, when we find a portion of Joel's prophecy that we're going to see again, once again, in the book of Acts, as Peter on the day of Pentecost is going to quote this passage that begins, "And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days I will pour out my spirit. And I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, the blood and the fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said. And among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord God calls." A portion of verse 32 that says, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord, called into question for me when Peter, turn forward with me to the book of Acts. I didn't use this one as a verse for the overhead, but if you turn to Acts 2, we'll look at how Peter quoted the same passage. We're basically beginning at verse 21. He says, and it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst. As you yourselves know, this Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. God raised him up, loosing the pains of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it. For David says concerning him, I saw the Lord always before me, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad, and my tongue rejoiced. My flesh also will dwell in hope. The thing that caught my attention most about that passage of Scripture is a question that came up from one of the young people about a week ago, meaning if God is calling us to simply call on him, where does everything else that I seem to see in the way of rules and examples and all the other things that the Bible is talking about, where does that fall into place? And one of the things that helped me to understand is whenever I'm looking at the Scriptures, it's an old principle that we've talked about before, but it's understanding that if Peter is an apostle, gifted with the ability to make the lame walk, as you'll see later on in the book of Acts, to do all kinds of miraculous signs, one of the things that's important to do is to understand what did it mean for Peter to call on the name of the Lord. And one of the things that he is going to do is, after he quotes Joel, he's not just going to shut it down there. He goes on to talk about some things that they have to do in response to the recognition and realization that they had a hand in crucifying Christ. And one of the things he talks about is being baptized so that they could receive the Holy Spirit. And then receiving the gift of the Holy Spirit, as Christ said in his own ministry, in the words that he gave his disciples as he was leaving in the Great Commission. Go therefore into all the world, making disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. The way that the apostle interprets this command or this passage from Joel to simply call on the name of the Lord, he's going to say there's some other things that you need to get done in order to be complete. And completeness is the thing that we talked about last week. As you will hopefully go back to Joel with me as we'll see even more. Chapter 3, building on that concept of completeness, will go on to say, beginning about verse 4, what are you to me, O Tyre and Sidon, and all the regions of Philistia? Are you paying me back for something? If you are paying me back, I will return your payment on your own heads, swiftly and speedily. For you have taken my silver and my gold and carried away my rich treasures to your temples. You have sold the people of Judah and Jerusalem to the Greeks in order to remove them far from their own border. Behold, I will stir them up from the place to which you have sold them, and I will return your payment on your own head. I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, to a nation far away, for the Lord has spoken. Verse 9, proclaim this among the nations. Consecrate for war. Stir up the mighty men. Let all the men of war draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords, and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am a warrior. Verse 11 continuing, hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down your warriors, O Lord. Let the nations stir themselves up and come to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Understanding the fact that the book of Joel is quite possibly using locusts to help them understand, as we've already mentioned, the breaches in their physical defenses, meaning they could potentially be preparing for a conflict for an old enemy, something they've seen before, a physical army that's just not coming, because the way that God is bringing the devastation this time is simply through insects. The same God who says he uses the meek to humble the mighty is going to take those who might have heard the same story from the prophets before, now talking about another army. He's basically, in addition to exposing the gaps or the breaches in their defenses, he's exposing the breaches in their expectations. understanding what Paul or Peter is going to say when he's quoting Joel. He's quoting a portion of prophecy that is helping the people understand that even though they might understand the need to call on the Lord to mean one thing, Peter is helping them to understand that it means something very different, helping them to understand that there is a gap between their understanding and the reality of what God has called them to do, or what the actual reality of answering God's call looks like, that they need to understand that they're going to have God actually close the gap between their expectations and the reality of what he has called them to be. And then finally here, the book of Joel does not necessarily end up in a hopeless place, because the passage that we chose to read from chapter 25 is basically helping us to understand that even though he is talking about the judgment of his people, he's going to carry that forward into the book of Amos. But it's also going to be super similar to what we see in the book of Isaiah, where he starts talking about the judgment on his people. But one of the things that goes along with these cycles of the prophecies is not only he basically taking, or is he not only basically taking the same pattern of showing the people the things that they need to do to avoid the potential calamity ahead, is he is telling them that the restoration that he is promising them is greater than what they could ever imagine. We said it before in terms of the book of Ezekiel. He used the imagery of the valley of dry bones. Do you really believe that these dry bones can live again? We've also looked at it from a different perspective, understanding how destitute David was when he was cast out from his own kingdom, chased by his son, not necessarily knowing whether or not he would see the throne again, brought back into a kingdom that was quite possibly more successful than he could ever have imagined, brought to even greater heights during the days of his son Solomon. And now we're seeing in the book of Joel one of the great prophecies about restoration in verse 25 of chapter 2. I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army which I sent among you. Understanding that chapter 2 is setting the stage for what he is talking about in chapter 3, where he is talking about two types of destruction coming to his people. One type of destruction is familiar with what we've talked about before. It's the kind of destruction that he warns about over and over again through his prophets. One that is related to mistakes that they have made. But then there's another type of destruction that he is talking about, and that is a destruction or a level of calamity or misfortune that comes about, as we frequently say, through no misfortune of their own. But the beauty of the story is whether or not the misfortune comes because of things that they've made, or situation or circumstances that they have created for themselves, or misfortune that has nothing to do with anything they've done. The restoration is absolutely the same. And appreciate it. The hope that it gave me this time is far too often you get to see. When I break down and I'm at a loss for words for how to sum up a passage or a portion of the story that God has given us, is ultimately, sometimes I just want to pick and choose the portions of a passage that are just most palatable. I want to just pick and choose the portions of the story that really kind of just destroy what God has written. And so when I try to reassemble it, sometimes it just doesn't work. And so I'm going to try to apologize to everybody and just kind of give you the story as I kind of see it and sum it up, and hopefully that'll give you at least something to take with you into this new year. The reason why I thought this story was great for the new year is because of that passage, verse 25 of chapter 2. The restoration that he promises is far greater than anything we can imagine. But there are times in life when the restoration that I am looking for comes, as I've said from time to time, in areas of my life where I've given up on the entire concept of people even caring about certain things like justice. People even caring about things like um, old sins. And one of the things I struggle with is um, the wisdom to let go and move forward. And I think that's one of the places where Joel gives me a great source of encouragement. Because there are a certain amount of times or a certain amount of points in my life where I talked this week about trying to move forward, being symbolized by the way that I had to realize that if I had to guess where my life would have been, it would not have led me to this place. Not that I have a problem being led to this physical place, but this point in my life. I was raised by a family that basically taught me, work a place, retire there. Try to do your best to provide some longevity and reliability to your company, and God willing, they'll return it to you. But my life didn't turn out that way. So what happened was I had to learn how to move, and I had to learn how to move frequently. And one of the things that ended up blessing me with as I became a preacher was the way in which I had to learn how to travel light. And it's one of the things I mentioned in some of the short lessons. Meaning, as much as I wanted to take a whole bunch of stuff with me everywhere I went, I started realizing how you didn't necessarily have to have a whole lot of stuff to start your life over again. And so then all of a sudden it started to make sense to me when the Bible was talking about things like, if you really want to be my disciple, learn to let go of everything so that you can move forward more effectively. One of the things that I began to learn as I dealt with the shame, he's talking about these people who no longer have to deal with shame, the shame of having to start over again and again and again started to decline the more I started to realize that God was teaching me lessons and realizing I didn't need as much as I thought I did. And so I started feeling less guilty as a preacher, asking people to look at these passages that are talking about maybe cut your ties to your expectations about what it is that you really need in your life so that maybe your life can look a little bit more consistently. The more you let him push you into some uncomfortable places, more like what he's really telling his disciples to be, as people who are not connected to the stuff that they have. Why? Because the overselling of my stuff, my house, my car, all the different things I've said I need if I'm actually going to be a functional member of society. I'm not going to be a burden on my family, but I can actually take care of my mother. Those are the kinds of things that God, one by one, began to pull as matchsticks from me and help me to understand that I can live without those things. I thought I was being super impressive when I whittled my life down to 3 suitcases and moved overseas, right? I'm not sure if I've told this story before, but when I got there, and I took a picture of it because I don't do a whole lot with pictures, but I was pretty proud of my whole life being whittled down to the trunk of a Volvo, my mom's old car, right? Until I got there and I was teaching students whose entire life was in a backpack. Single backpack, probably about the size of what one of y'all might have gotten gifted for Christmas. And so all those lessons that I had learned about whittling my life down, I thought I'd learned one starting out as a missionary until I saw people who had actually had a whole lot less. And one of the things we say from time to time is, how can they still be happy with so little? Well, until you let God push you out into some of those places, you don't learn. And so that's what I began to realize. Along with all of the shame of having to move so often, I was starting to learn to have that level of fulfillment that was just kind of a stereotype of people in poorer parts of the world. And then this book started to make a whole lot more sense to me. And so books like the book of Joel started to make a whole lot more sense to me. Because what I started to realize was there was this perpetual gap, thus the illustration, between what I thought I needed to be happy and what I was really experiencing. And so what happened was, as I began to look at the things that we're pointing out, there was a time I grew up just like everybody else. I was super patriotic. I saw all of the shoot 'em up movies, from the cowboys and westerns to the army movies. I wanted my guys. Mom was nice enough to let me have an air gun right around the time I don't remember how long. Shot my first bird right in the backyard of that old house in Houston, right? Probably illegal as all get out, but I did it anyway because I wanted to shoot something, right? But it's a huge disappointment to see the movies gas me up into thinking I got all this just because I got this gun in my hand, and start realizing the reality of what it actually feels like to shoot something. Until you learn what it's like to actually aim, you're causing a whole lot of suffering that first time you actually watch something die. And so there's this huge level of drop-off, or there's this gap between what I thought it was going to be like to shoot something and what it actually was like watching it. It's just a bird, but watching it suffer and watching it die. And even if I get over that and I learn to just shoot stuff and, well, we got to eat, right? I start learning about all the different gaps of the things that guns won't protect me from. And when somebody finally pulls me aside and teaches me how to use my hands a little bit, then I start feeling like a coward when I got to rely on my guns to overcompensate for the fact that I just wasn't very much with my hands. And more importantly, when people are teaching you to use your hands, God willing, the ones who are really strong are teaching you how a weak man runs to his hands first anyway. There's this huge gap between the level of courage I thought I had when I could finally do this and the reality that that was still a crutch for me inside, not knowing necessarily how to relate to people. And over time, what you start to realize is that these and these are just crutches. That nowadays, as we talked about it before, one of the things I really regret about young people having to grow up in this society today is how tough it is for them to just go up to somebody and say hi and start a conversation without being considered nutty. Or, right? Because it used to be that's the way we met each other. And you weren't considered weird because you waved at somebody and said hello. But now it's getting worse. I've talked about that before. It's getting worse because you're having people who are more and more emboldened to just be flat out rude because they're carrying something. And that gets old because that's not courage. I've talked about it before. That's gun courage. And gun courage is very different than man courage, and it's way different than God courage. And that's what one of those gaps in coverage is. The enemy tells me or told me when I was growing up, let me preach it from my perspective. If I simply had that gun, couldn't nobody mess with me unless they just knew how to shoot better. That's faulty. Because God was bringing them problems, like we said, that they couldn't shoot. Likewise, beyond the guns and all that, by the time you get to the second illustration I gave in chapter 2, where Peter's quoting it, there are times in my life where, like I said, I just wanted the Bible, I thought I'd had it hard enough already. And I wanted the Bible to tell me something that just gave me a break. So I would skip to that part that talks about the restoration, right? That's why, of course, I try to pick the happy passages. That's why I picked that one. I figured y'all like that one because I fall in the same temptation all the time. I just want the happy parts. I think I've had it difficult enough. I got a chance to talk to my brother Ryan this morning in the young adults class. That there are times in life where, I might want it. And I forgot the illustration we used, brother. But there are times in, and when I think that I have reached the edge of my limits. And one of the things that has really helped me out is one of those Navy SEALs principles I heard. We've got Brother Richard here today. And Richard's one of those brothers who's visiting. He had been in the Navy. And so my version of Richard's story is he's actually a Navy SEAL. As opposed to, but, so every time I think of a Navy SEAL story, get a tip from the Navy SEALs, I think Richard more often than not. But one of the things I literally did hear from Navy SEALs is the 40% rule. And that 40% rule is when you feel like you are whooped and gassed out and you don't want no more. They will say scientifically, your mind is at 100% quit when your body is only at 40% capacity. And so there are times when I want this Bible to give me a break because my mind is saying I'm at 100% quit. But what God realizes is the science that goes, as we talked about before, I don't need to go into my doctor's office or to go see my nurse with my Google diagnosis. I need to let God diagnose my problem and tell me that my 100% quit is really a trigger for letting me know that I still got about 60% left if I will let God continue to work with me. But the thing that you see in what Paul is quoting from, call on the name of the Lord, is that represents one of those. See, it's easy for me. I grew up in the churches of Christ. And so we did not necessarily adopt that whole principle. All I got to do is call on the name of the Lord. All I got to do is say a prayer. But we do the same thing with baptism. We talk about rates of attrition in the churches of Christ. Why is it such a huge thing for us to get worried when we send our kids off to college and whatnot? Why is it a worry? Because we know once we get them baptized, they're in it for life. No, we worry because we realize the rates of attrition. Regardless of what they're doing in the Baptist church, they're a problem for us too, right? And so ultimately what's happening is we just have a different form of making the same problem, thinking that calling on the name of the Lord, if we just read a little bit further and understand how Peter used it, then we're safe too. No, we're dealing with the same problems in a different way. And so one of the things is when we're talking about that 40% rule, phrases like call on the name of the Lord are 40%. They're the kinds of scriptures I want to latch on to and say, if I just do this thing, if I just call on the name of the Lord, I am good. But the facts and the numbers are showing us something different. See, no matter how much we preach calling on the name of the Lord, or baptism is the point at which we can lock it down, shut it down, and mail it in, the numbers are showing us that we, as the body of Christ, before we had all these different denominations, he is showing us all that we have the same problem. Calling on the name of the Lord is a lifelong commitment, that even if it feels like you are, as we said, 100% tapped out, that is a gap in reality, because your reality is God is calling you to another level of commitment. We talked about last week. The reason why that's so important is because of these restoration passages. It's because of the fact that he's providing us such a comprehensive level of coverage that it makes absolutely no sense for me to try to bargain hunt. That's one of the short lessons that's coming up. But that's what I find I do in my life. Just like I went into a culture that would make negotiations, and bartering was a thing. See, in the States, we go into a store, and the price we see on the sticker, unless it's a car or a house, we don't negotiate that much. I went to a culture where you negotiate for everything. And the problem with that is if you carry that mentality into a relationship with Christ, then what you'll start to see is, just like the Allstate commercials, the coverage that you thought you had is completely different from what actually existed. Calling on the name of the Lord is going to be more than saying a sinner's prayer. It's going to be more than baptism, right? Your security is going to be have to be rooted in more than what you can fight or what you can shoot or what you can, nowadays, sometimes just consider just as clever. One of the other things I want to stay away from is, I'm going to talk to just the ladies for a bit, Coming from a perspective of, often talking about, I can only understand other people's struggles from my own. I understand the whole struggle with discrimination from the black perspective. And one of the things I will tell you is we are tempted to overcompensate in life, whether you are black, white, Asian, Native, whatever. When you are denied an opportunity and you finally get it, I say it from time to time, the temptation is to overcompensate. And that is one of the things I had to learn as I began to get different opportunities, not to get too big-headed about the success that I was experiencing, because God is able and willing to restore. There are going to be times in your life where you might have been the run of the litter. But once you get over that whole run of the litter phase, you will realize that the way that people see you is not how God sees you. And so there are some times when God will allow you to spend most of your life as the run of the litter, because when he blesses you, he's going to bless you big. And we say it from time to time. You got to have to be able to understand how to handle success and failure. I'm pointing this one at the ladies because we are in a point in our society where women, we've talked about it before, are being made to feel inferior when they simply want to adopt pretty much a traditional biblical lifestyle. Right? And I'm not telling you that's how you have to live, but I'm telling you, if you're really free, you have the freedom to live the way that you see, not the way Marcus sees God calling you to be. You have the freedom to read the Bible for yourself and be whoever it is he's called you to be. But understand, if you decide that you are out in the workplace, don't make the same mistake that we were tempted to make in the 60s during the civil rights movement. Because what I'm seeing now is an overcompensation. Where, as I say from time to time, try not to become the thing you hate. I'm running into too many situations where I am seeing women who are being devalued for their meekness and valued because of the way that they can put a man in his place. I'm just going to say it because I've experienced it. and as a man. It's one thing if you are like Mama. There were times in life when I was on the mission field. Mama, I told you, Mama was supporting the mission. She wasn't the only one, but she was one of them. But I'm going to tell you, as a man, it gets old constantly being put in your place when you're the one paying all the bills. And I'm not talking about Mama. I'm talking about trying to defend my Mama. Right? And so now there are situations where you will find yourself in a position where you are finally exalted to be where you're at, where you're going to be told that your value is in talking down to people. Your value is in condescending to people. Your value is in minimizing those who once minimized you. And all I'm saying is those people don't have to go home to your house once they get you gassed up to possibly minimize your sons, your husbands, etc. I can't speak for women. All I can do is speak from my experience and understand the ways in which I was tempted to destroy relationships because I was trying to impress people who don't live in my house. There are people, I'll talk to you again from the black experience, once we get a degree, not everybody was able to get degrees at the same rate we were. And so what happened was there was this division in the community that's called this class division now. And so as some of us were beginning to find our way through the colleges, others of us were being left behind. And there was this resentment that was being built up within the community between those who were the first and second generation to get college degrees and those who were still working everyday jobs making an honest living. And it was an unnecessary division that we experienced in my community, that God willing, I would spare you, regardless of where you fall within the women's movement. First of all, appreciate the freedom you have to be whoever it was that God called you to be. But beyond that, once you decide what your path is going to be and the path that God has you set on, and ladies, feel free to pull me aside, correct me, whatever if I'm going too far. But I'm not trying to tell you how to be women. I'm just trying to tell you the mistakes we made in a civil rights movement that happened 40-something years ago. I'm trying to tell you not to destroy your homes for the sake of your progress. Because at the end of the day, ultimately, once again, the people who are setting the standard that you might be tempted to live up to, you don't always know what their home looks like. And that's one of those gaps in coverage. The enemy overpromised us. He overpromised us freedom, and he underdelivered, like they call it, the work-life balance. He didn't promise me a home life that would get fixed if I got my college degree, and I got my advanced degree, and I got all the money that I thought I wanted. My home life was still a struggle. And so what happens is the enemy, unlike God who over-delivers, he overpromised what I would be able to carve out for myself in terms of allowing the enemy to set my ideals and my goals for me. I talk about it from time to time. When I've got, over the years, I've had some amazing guidance counselors. They're the people in school who help you understand, well, if you really want to do this, Marcus, you need to take these classes, you need to do these things, you need to check these boxes. The guidance counselors, it's almost like they tell you in school. Some of the gaps in coverage in the educational system that I've started to see people talk about, why don't they teach us more about money in school? Because there are a lot of people who are taking advantage of the fact that we graduate and we're going off to these colleges not understanding how to manage our debt. And it's easier for them to make money if we're paying off on interest. Okay, I'm not going to go off. But y'all, I'm seeing enough nods. Y'all get where I'm coming from, right? So all this time we spend in school, we could be learning things about money that could keep our personal debts down. But we're less a mark for those who would exploit us, right, financially. Likewise, same thing for your home. Out of all those classes we take in school, why don't they give us more counseling early on? Why aren't they a little bit more honest with us about what their home lives actually look like after they've gotten all their degrees? I'm going to tell you one of the reasons why, trying not to tell too many stories, but there are no names attached to this one. Y'all know that I do a whole lot of armchair counseling with my little counseling terms, right? I try not to make it armchair because I don't want to dishonor my counseling instructors, right? But when we were first being introduced to counseling, not every counseling instructor is created the same. And so what happened was we were being counseled by some folks who were super transparent. They were helping us to understand how these principles they were teaching us actually played out in their lives. But I can't tell you how disappointed I was when I started seeing some of my counseling instructors realizing that their lives weren't perfect, but getting advice that would have been a whole lot more if they would have simply let me know how it was playing out in their lives. And that's all I'm telling you, is when you're looking at these advanced degrees, all of the things that the world is telling you is going to help you out, I think I've said it before. Maybe you're best suited when you find a counselor who is willing to be transparent enough to let you know how the advice they're giving you has actually worked out for them, so that we don't have as much of a gap in what we're being sold in the way of advice. So with that, I apologize for rambling, but there are times when sometimes I thank God for it. It's happening too much, so I apologize. But there are times when, God's like, you keep talking about just telling the whole truth, but you keep picking my words out of order and trying to retell the story in an order I didn't tell it in. And that's essentially what I was trying to do. It might have been greatest of intentions. But at the end of the day, I wasn't really telling you enough of my life so that I'm not being the preacher who's completely inconsistent with what I'm telling you to look for in a counselor. And God willing, giving you enough insight into how this has affected me personally to help you pick and choose whatever it is you think this word might have in the way of assistance and help for you. And so as we are going into the new year, one of the reasons why I thought the book of Joel, or especially Joel chapter 2, was effectively or especially effective is, it's not easy for me, or it's not hard for me this time, to really wish everybody the best. I really wish that wherever you have found yourself at this point in life, this year marks a great restoration for you. But understand that we will never see the kind of restoration he's promised his people here in the book of Joel unless we realize that within those cycles of prophets like Joel and about 100 years later, Isaiah and about 100 years later, Jeremiah and a Daniel, if we do not allow God to seal up the gaps in our coverage. I talk about it all the time. If God wants an apology from me, I wouldn't know where to begin. But one of the apologies I at least have this much common sense to recognize that I owe him is creating an image of God that he never promised he would be. Trying to hold him accountable for things he never promised. And getting angry and frustrated with him when the God I created didn't produce the results that they were my fiction. The gap that I created. And that is one of the reasons why when we look at this whole concept of idolatry, we talked about it before, the block of wood means nothing. The stone means nothing. It's the narrative that allows me to create, that basically creates a God that doesn't exist and hold him accountable to that standard. By the same token, if any of you have ever had the chance to feel disappointing, then you know what it's like, on the one hand, to actually I'm not gonna lie, I told Miss Katie, I told Brother Bob I was going to get by this week, and I didn't make it. So as I told her this week, as I'm talking about disappointment, I was a disappointment this week. Hopefully he didn't expect me because he knows Mark, yeah, anyway. But it's one thing for me to be disappointed because of the things that I have done. It's another thing for you to understand what it's like to be disappointed because of what people call a straw man. And that's back in what I used to do. What we would do was, I tried to never do this, but we had to be wary of the fact that it was a tactic. What happens is there are times when people, when they're in a dispute with you, they will, as much as we talk about getting everybody in the same room together to sort out our disputes, one of the reasons why that is so hard to do is because there are some people who prefer to operate in darkness. There are some people who prefer to have a conversation outside of your presence because it allows them to create a straw man, an image of you that never existed. And so the reason why some of you are never going to get to confront your accusers the way that the criminal justice system said, you don't get to convict a person without giving them their day in court. Don't you wish it worked that way in the churches? Oh my goodness, right? For sure, right? But how often does it really work that way? See, sometimes it's just an accident. Sometimes it's because, as the Bible said, it's easier for me to argue against my image of you than it is for me to actually have to talk to you. Because if I talk to you, I might not be able to keep my grudge. And here's the thing. There are times when what I really want, I don't want the peace. I want the grudge. And so I run for the darkness because I don't want him in the room. I want the image of him that I've created. And so now freeze there and please apply that to God. Understand how wrong it is of me. And if I have anything I know I can apologize to God for, it's to the degree that I've created a straw man image of God. I know what it's like to argue against an image I can't, I'm not in the room. I can't defend that. I never promised I was going to be that. And more importantly, God never said that's what I was supposed to be. So understand in the same way that when we are setting our hopes and our expectations in God, one of the reasons why it's so important to look at those passages like, if you got a problem with your brother, I know, I'm a dead horse, but that's one of the songs we used to sing when I was coming up. I like that one. Right? One of the reasons why it's so important to get in the practice of actually going to our brothers and sisters to create healing is because it's a practice that God allows us for the way in which we actually relate to him. So instead of creating false images of our brother and sister, he says, get to really know your brother and sister. And then likewise, get to really know me. Simply stated, we call it Bible study, right? But it's more than Bible study. It's helping us understand how we can close the gap between what I might have fictionalized God to be and what he actually is. And so God willing, as we go forward in this year, I pray that he give you restoration beyond your wildest imagination that's rooted in who he actually is, as we together stand and sing.